This is week 2 of PR613, Organizational Communications, being taught at the Graduate School of Public Relations at Iona College. Let me remind you that all of the details for week 2 and the rest of the course are found on Blackboard. You can find the foils, the PowerPoints that are being used for this lecture under week 2. The lecture itself is going to be found elsewhere on the web. It'll be available through the announcements section of the site. Let's start. Today we're going to talk about foundations of organizational theory. Where did it come from? How has it evolved over time? And how is it playing out in today's world? We're also going to talk about how organizations and communications work together, how important they are. I'll give you an overview of the leadership paper that needs to be written by the end of the course, and I want to talk a little bit about Fortune Magazine's Best Companies to Work For competition that happens every year. Let me talk about the foundations of organizational theory. This is the way that theoreticians, business people, academics think about how organizations function. And believe it or not, this is not an old process. It's about the end of the 19th century when people really started to think about how organizations should be formed. And if you remember, this was when people were moving from the farms into factories, into the cities. We're going to talk about today the classical school, which was the original way that people learned to codify, learned to take the ways that organizations were being built and put it down on paper. That evolved in the middle of the last century into the human relations school, when people became more important in organizations. Now, there are other major theories that have developed in the last 20 years, and we'll give those a cursory look because they're still under development, they're still being thought through. And then we're going to talk about, as each one of these theories, what the implications are for us as communications professionals in organizations. The first theory that I want to talk about is the classical scientific management organization school of thought. You can see on this chart that there's an evolution of the way management's thought about organization and the way organizations have operated over time. As you go down the chart, you see that the nature of society has changed from agrarian or farm-based, where people essentially worked for themselves, or they may have worked in a family unit, and they used animals as the predominant way of applying labor to their work, but they worked a lot of hours and they got only paid for what they produced. Over the period of the 19th century, that moved into the industrial era, where organizations became bigger, people moved into them, there had to be some way of managing organizations, and with management comes communication. How do you talk to people? How do you explain what they're supposed to do? How do you tell them how much they are supposed to do? How do you provide them with the skills and the training? So we'll talk about that. After that, in the post-World War II era, came the post-industrial era. And that was when people were more valuable than their backs. In other words, people were valued for their thinking, not only because they could lift things or carry or put tops on bottoms in a factory setting. So as you look at this chart, and I recommend that you spend some time with it, you'll see the evolution of the way things were managed, the kind of information that was needed, the assumptions about the human condition and the nature of work. And over time, there is a correlation between organizations, the kinds of people who were in them, the communications that was needed, and the outputs. Important to note that we're all concentrated on the output of organizations, because organizations, by definition, are put into place or are created or evolve for a given purpose. We'll talk more about that. This slide simply shows a man and two mules working in a field, representative of the agrarian society. No communications needed there except between the man and his mules. So it was a very simple, unsophisticated way of life. The next slide shows an early industrial factory. Better known as, this one is specifically the Gates Rubber Factory. Now, Gates was one of the first industrial giants in the United States, and the company produced rubber products like fan belts and other industrial equipment. It was the largest non-tire company in the United States, and it's just representative of what was going on in those early industrial companies. It grew and grew and grew, and part of what we learn from these kinds of companies is that they had to figure out how to communicate, how to help people manage so that they could be productive. The classical school of organizational design was developed and codified, became written down in an effort to resolve the tension between the organizational needs and human needs. An organization was put together, say, to produce tires, produce cars, very basic kinds of things. In the earlier days, it produced simple things like shoes. But as you can imagine, there had to be some way of transmitting the information, of training people, and of moving the products into the marketplace. So we look at the classical school, and it was simply a way of writing down what the early entrepreneurs, the early managers, the early craftsmen have been doing. They wrote down procedures. How do you start? Where do you get the basic equipment? Where do you get the raw materials? What are the skills needed? How do you pass those on? And importantly, one of the things that the classical school did was to eliminate arbitrary supervisor behavior. If you remember, we talked about the early days when people were valued for their strength. Well, the people who were put in charge of work gangs were oftentimes the largest, most aggressive, strongest people. And they managed their work gangs by dint of their power, their ability to make people do what they wanted to do. Well, not a very effective way of managing. If you've ever been on if you ever worked for a boss who wasn't very good at what he or she did, you know, it wasn't a way to develop loyalty. It wasn't a way to get people to do their best work. So there was a way implicit in the classical school of defining what managers were to do to get the best work out of their employees. Thirdly, motivating employees with money. We take it as a given today that money is a good motivating factor, but in the early days people were motivated not only by money, but the ability to get off the farm, the place to live, to go to the city for more opportunity. Money was not seen as a prime object. Classical school said, yes, money is a highly important motivating factor and should be brought into the mix formally. Four key components of the classical school. Division of labor. In other words, some people were making some parts, some people were putting those parts together, some people were doing the quality check. So different kinds of skills. And this was different from the earlier artisan way of doing things when, for example, a shoemaker would make everything that had to do with a shoe. A knife maker would create the knife or other tools from top to bottom, would take the raw materials. In the factory setting, the industrial setting, there would be divisions of labor, people doing different things.